Good evening. First of all, I would wish to thank the Esser Institute for the opportunity to speak today. It's an honor. I will be speaking about a second campaign and proposal that has been pursued for a long time. Amazingly long time, I have to say. If you look at the degree of economic interdependence today, you will see that 100 years ago, immediately before the First World War, we already had such a strong degree of, as we call it today, globalization in the economic realm. And then already, even before the First World War, the idea of a world parliament, a democratically elected body of all world citizens, was discussed. Even then. And interestingly, it was said that the degree of economic interdependence makes the separation of foreign policy and domestic policy obsolete, because there are two strong influences that are coming from the international level, so that there is the necessity to have political decision-making in a democratic way at this international level. And already then it was said that this fact that there is no such, integrated policy-making at the international level, that there is still the separation between foreign policy, which is in the prerogative of the executive branch of government, and domestic policy, which is in the realm, of parliamentarism. This separation undermines democracy, was already said 100 years ago. And I think it is interesting to refer to this fact today, because many observers seem to realize that there are certain parallels that we witness today. And obviously, the idea of a world parliament is still new to many people, and it is still something that we have to pursue very strongly at the level of governments, government advocacy. Our campaign, the campaign for a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, hasn't reinvented the wheel. We have been picking up a proposal that has actually come forward for the first time in 1948 by a US-American lawyer, Louis Sohn, who, when the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe was established as an integral part of the Council of Europe, an intergovernmental organization, said that if this is possible here, why can't we do that also at the UN? And never mind, let me mention that the idea of adding a parliamentary body to the League of Nations was also proposed during the peace talks in Versailles, but it was dismissed. The only delegate who actually came forward for this came from South Africa. And interestingly also, let me mention this in passing, the first government to this day at the cabinet level that endorsed the idea of the world parliament was the first democratically elected government in Germany after the First World War. In 1919, Germany suggested that the League of Nations should include a parliamentary body. Of course, what Germany had to say on this topic wasn't relevant at the time, and maybe it will become more relevant in these times. Anyway, we are drawing on a long, long history of political advocacy, of theoretical thinking, academic work, and the basic idea that we are today pursuing as an international campaign is a step-by-step approach, which means that we would begin very modestly with a body that would actually come from national parliaments or regional parliaments, like the European Parliament, largely would be having consultative rights, and step by step it would be growing and in powers, and the democratic legitimacy of its composition would also increase, meaning that at the beginning, as I said, national parliaments would send the delegates, but clearly, and that's also an official goal of the campaign, over time we would like the delegates in this body to be directly elected by the world citizens. So it is important to recognize that a UN Parliamentary Assembly is not an end in itself. It would be a first step in a long-term process. And it has been useful to point out, to draw on the example of the European Parliament that developed in a similar way, from the Common Assembly of the European Communities in the 50s and 60s to today's legislative body of the European Union. And interestingly, at the beginning, the European integration process was fragmented. There were different communities for different subject areas, But what happened was that this parliamentary body was established as a common body of all. Although these intergovernmental bodies formally were separate, this parliamentary body, the early European Parliament, was the parliamentary body of all of them. And in a similar way, we could argue that the UN Parliamentary Assembly would be a means also to overcome the fragmentation of the UN system and of international law, as it could be implemented as a parliamentary body that actually spans over the whole UN system. And I mean, you can break it down to the committee level, where I imagine a UNPA would have committees dealing with different UN institutions and subject areas, for example, also the Sustainable Development Goals and so on, and exercise oversight on these things. And at the committee level, we also think, that is the discussion at the moment, that a UNPA could be more than just a replication of what we know as parliamentary assemblies at the regional level, like the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe also, or the Pan-African Parliament. It could be something more innovative and something that includes more, forward-thinking elements. And at the committee level, to come back to that idea, at the committee level, it could be a kind of network of networks, meaning that we would include relevant actors at the committee level who would be integrated into the Assembly's work, and then it would go up to the plenary where, prioritization would take place, something that, for example, isn't happening today really between human rights and world trade law and so on. So that's one of the things the Assembly could do in terms of overcoming fragmentation. But there's, of course, more why we believe the UN Parliamentary Assembly would be extremely important. And we want to achieve as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So if we were able to achieve a democratically elected world parliament soon, we would of course go for that. But at this time, we are rather discussing models and approaches that would actually be precursors of a UN Parliamentary Assembly that would be based on a UN decision. Maybe I should mention that as well, because often it is said that, okay, we can forget about this idea, from the beginning, because it would require charter reform. And as is well known, at least among international scholars, charter reform is something that we can, forget for the moment, at these times anyway. But interestingly, it would be easier to establish a parliamentary assembly with 800 delegates than adding just one single seat to the Security Council, because Security Council modification requires charter reform, and the establishment of a parliamentary assembly, at least a parliamentary assembly that has advisory functions mainly, would be possible through a decision of a UN General Assembly according to Article 22 of the Charter. This is a paradox, but it's also an opportunity. So in theory, and that's what we are actually working on, in theory, the UN General Assembly, and I argue by majority vote, could install a UN Parliamentary Assembly as a subsidiary body. That is the goal. And then, once that has happened, or maybe it can install something smaller as a precursor, which could then develop into that direction. But once we have achieved this, then the strategy can be pursued that this body would develop over time into something stronger. And this is actually a world federalist idea, that once we have this thing in place, it would be its own best advocate, because inside this assembly there would be parliamentarians who would recognize that what they are doing there is important, and they would advocate vis-à-vis governments and other institutions that this body would have to be strengthened. And I mean, generally from the perspective of the efficiency of the United Nations, one could argue that a parliamentary assembly would be a very, very good addition. First of all, in the area of accountability and representation. At this time, in terms of representation, the UN is based on the principle of one state, one vote, which means also that who is represented at the UN are representatives of the executive branch. And minorities and opposition parties, they are not included. An idea that was already obvious before the First World War. And still we are working against very strong resistance, because this idea that the international level and the UN is intergovernmental by definition, and that's it. This is still so strongly ingrained in the thinking. So we are actually not only working against political obstacles, but also against obstacles in the perception of what international diplomacy means and what the world community actually means and how it should work together or not work together. Well, in terms of accountability and representation, one state, one vote as basic international law principle at the United Nations, it means, from a cosmopolitan point of view, that there is, mathematically, a 2/3 majority possible in the General Assembly that represents around 8% of the world's population. How can a decision of such a body be democratic if it represents 8% of the world's population? It's not. So let's forget about the Security Council, where democratic and representative character is obviously, in doubt. But then it is celebrated that the General Assembly is such a democratic body, but it's not if you look at it from a cosmopolitan point of view. So we would say that all this debate about General Assembly revitalization and strengthening of the UN cannot take place without the thought that at this time in history, and even 100 years ago already, we need to complement this intergovernmentalism through direct representation of the citizens. And just one more example, if you look at indigenous people, there are around 250 to 350 million indigenous people in the world. The 100 least populous countries in the world have around the same population. In the General Assembly, they have 100 votes. And the 350 or 250 million indigenous people, they have 0 votes and seats. There are, advisory capacities and bodies and so on, but in reality, they have no say at the UN. And that's just unbearable from a democratic point of view. So a UN Parliamentary Assembly as a network of networks, to come back to that concept, would have to make sure that such voices of minorities are included in the work. I mean, the details are, the devil is in the details. That has to be discussed, and that's what we are doing. And I can't present you a perfect model for that, but it's clear that that's what we have to achieve, that opposition parliamentarians, that minorities, and these are also integrated in global policy making through a parliamentary body. More efficiency. Why would a UNPA add more efficiency to decision making at the UN? Because normally when we talk to government parliamentarians from the beginning in major international deliberations, then there is a better likelihood that they would actually ratify the outcomes of these negotiations at home, in their home parliament. So if the parliamentarians are from the beginning included, you would lessen the risk of them at home saying no to the outcomes of an international treaty negotiation. So I would argue this adds to the efficiency of the overall process. Well, more democratic, I of course mentioned that already in terms of involvement of parliamentarians. Opposition parliamentarians would have to be included, meaning that if we look at models for the distribution of seats or the allocation of seats, one precondition that we would say is that from every country there would have to be at least 2 representatives. Of course, there are many models out there, but this is one that I would advocate, meaning that for every country there would be at least 1 representative coming from the government coalition or government party, and the other coming from the opposition. So we would add some complexity, but also some, a broader spectrum of political thought in the assembly. And it will also produce better solutions in the common global interest, because these people in the assembly, they would organize according to their political view, and not according to geopolitical origin, like national groups and continental regional groups and so on. But we foresee that there would be a socialist group, a green group, a liberal group, a whatever, a conservative group, and they would work together across national boundaries, trying to find a solution for the problem at hand. And they wouldn't necessarily, like it's in the case in the European Parliament, first think about, okay, how far is this good or bad for my government and my country? They would think about, okay, and how far does this or that solution make sense from the background of my political ideology? And that makes an extremely big difference if you compare to how negotiations are taking place today. Because today, if the representatives of the executive branch meet, what they do is they try to find the lowest common denominator. They have to, especially since decision making is more or less based on consensus. So the weakest link actually dictates, if you want to have a broad base of the treaty, the weakest link actually dictates the outcome already if you want to have this country on board. So you would have to make compromises. And if you move into this direction of world law and parliamentarism, there would be a new principle, namely the principle of majority voting. This is far away, I recognize that, but it's an important from consensus decision making towards qualified, at the beginning, qualified majority voting. I don't know how much time there is still left. 2 minutes? Okay. Yeah, but that's fine. Well, interestingly, the principle of including parliamentarians in intergovernmental organizations is widely recognized at the regional level already. There are 150 international parliamentary institutions around 150 already in place working. There are different categories, but if you look at the regional level, regional integration processes and organizations, you will find a lot of them. The Pan-African Parliament, then you have a lot of parliamentary bodies in Africa at the regional level, like the East African Legislative Assembly, or in South America, Latin America, you have similar bodies, and so on. And of course in Europe, and I mentioned it already, the very first parliamentary body of an intergovernmental organization, which was the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Then, of course, the European Parliament. And funnily and interestingly, amazingly, this whole idea is dismissed if it comes to the UN and intergovernmental organizations at the global level completely. You would find international parliamentary institutions of the kind of, let's come together and discuss world trade, okay? And then the representative of the World Trade Organization would provide a lecture saying, okay, describing what the WTO does and what the principles are and so on. And then the parliamentarians would go away and think, okay, now I learned something, or they would even adopt a resolution which wouldn't have any effect at all on the agenda setting. So there are these institutions, but we have the parliamentary bodies that are more effective. And it is really amazing that at the UN and the dozens of UN institutions, I'm not even only speaking about the core UN organization, but whatever you want, the UNDP, UNEP, UNICEF, whatever, the international financial institutions, the World Trade Organization, there's no parliamentary body at all. And I think that needs to be justified. It's not us actually who need to advocate, okay, this is really, really very helpful. Quite the contrary, it needs to be justified why this is not being done at the UN level. And that's one of the purposes of our campaign. Maybe just a few sentences to finish about the campaign. Right, it was established 10 years ago as an effort to synergize existing support for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. The World Federalist Movement was a key actor and network that we could work with. Now 1,500 current and former members of parliament signed up to the idea. We have collected support by more than 300 university professors, among them some of them of the world's leading universities. There are, I don't know how many Nobel laureates who signed up to the campaign. Just yesterday we received a statement from Tunisia. From it, Madou, who was, who received the Nobel Prize on behalf of the National Tunisian Dialogue Quartet, was convinced of the urgent need to create a strong democratic connection between the people and their government. To face the global economic, social, and environmental challenges, the international government system needs a democratic revolution as well. With the support of the people and the necessary democratic legitimacy, elected representatives in a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly could work efficiently to find new global solutions, to fight poverty and the consequences of climate change. We need to act now and implement democratic principles at the largest scale of government if we want them to survive the recent rise of nationalism that is threatening peace and international understanding. Well, in this sense, thank you very much for listening, and I'm sure that we will discuss some of the details of this proposal now in the question and answer session. Thank you.